Hello, everyone. Hello, if you're just letting everybody in, we're going to give it a few minutes to get started. Let everyone join up. I love the turnout. A lot of familiar names in here. And we'll give it maybe 5 or so. There's the poll. Would love to hear how you guys heard about us. Someone from my team. Okay. Hello, Joe. Okay. Let's see here. We got it all up. I'm going to keep everyone's faces up. If you share your camera, I'll be looking for inquiring eyes, body language that suggests that you have a question, etc. Whoops. And we can continue through the webinar. In the chat, who do we have? Hi, everyone. Welcome. Yes, Joe. Hello, Jeremy. Okay. All right. I think we'll give it maybe a couple more minutes. Let's check out that poll, actually. Where'd everybody come from? All right. So, for those of you who are not introduced to this overall group presenting here today, my name is Eric. I am the CEO of a company called Headcount 365. I'm here to produce the content for today's webinar, which I assume is very popular, closing out what 2023 is. But I am here on behalf of a much larger collective of bootstrapped talent leaders who left a corporate thing to start something to serve the community again. So whether it's a recruiting operations cohort, the peer-to-peer training, women in talent, culture-centric HR products, or Headcount 365, we're all here as kind of like a group to kind of bootstrap what is a community to serve the community. So if you're in recruiting, there are few resources for you that don't have some sort of ulterior motive. And so we're here to provide education, empowerment, a connection. We're here to kind of group peer-to-peer learnings together so that our teams can have the best possible experience moving forward. So I will kind of jump into who we are and what we're doing, and then we'll get into today's content. But there are 6 individual communities that are a part of what it is that we're doing here today. And all of us, there's some level of call to action for each of them that we can send you to either join. Sorry, just fixing one thing. Okay, these are the communities to join or to engage with after the call. So Talent Collective, this is the empowerment of an advancement and connection of women in talent. PURPL is peer-to-peer learning. So that's run by Joe Atkinson. And so you could either do a class with them and get some of your knowledge out into the space, or take from that community some learnings that he's already curated. Unicorn Talent is my, that's the playbook I ran when I was a talent leader at Uber, at Bird Scooters, and I've made it free. So I used to consult to investment banks, what's the headcount plan, what's the comp framework. So all those tools are now available for download. And if you need them in your department, they are resources you could use and download for free, but used by unicorn companies across the world. The people group, that's a Slack group. So if you would like to join that group, there is a link I'll be sending out after the webinar. And it's just 4,000 plus folks who get together and talk HR shop. The RecOps Collective, put on by Jeremy Lyons here, is a community around the recruiting operations space, and CultureBot is a Slack application for remote workers to keep a good culture the best that you can. And so this, like I said, we're all bootstrapped. We're all trying to get something off the ground. We're all trying to be in the talent community. Engage with us, download some stuff, sign up for the things. You will be happy that you did, because we're just trying to grow something, again, very unique to our space that we don't think exists quite yet. And so a little bit about me. I used to be an internal recruiting leader. I was at Uber, I was at Bird, I was at Clutter, Slice. I was at a bunch of different internal recruiting leadership positions, and I built a playbook for a lot of this is going to come from that today. And then for a couple of years, I even rolled it out on behalf of investment firms. So if they gave a company an investment, I would go and I would roll out the recruiting department in that firm. And I would do everything from what is the headcount plan to what's your comp framework to what's the process and how do you evaluate the performance of that process. And there are many ways to do it: scorecards, funnel metrics, QBRs. And then what we're going to cover today is the data from your annual headcount plan. So that is a process that I built many a times with spreadsheets over and over again to try to wrangle the data created by hiring managers and by finance and by the executive team, so much so that I couldn't really think of a way to do it with current tools that were on the market. So I made Headcount 365, which automates almost everything that we'll see here today. So while this is meant for you to take away and use in your process as it stands today, if you like the concepts, reach out. I'm happy to give you an overview of what's going on. Okay, so the 2023 headcount plan, I assume most of you are on a Jan to December fiscal year or something close to it, which means you've had a whole 11 months of activity happen. And in that space, what happens at the core of every company's plan is at the beginning of the year, they said, we're going to do X. And then they give that to the business and the business changes it. The hiring managers take two roles and they make them one role. They overhire, they hire over comp. They change the title midway through the recruiter working on it, therefore delaying the time to fill by the time of the change, right? So your headcount activity is a constant stream of data that today is rarely harnessed in a way that is it's rarely harnessed in a way that gives people the tools that they need to do their work. Okay, just one quick thing. All right. So every single piece of what it is that we're doing here. So let me just jump in. I got a couple more things here. Okay, I think we're caught up. All right, so at every point that a plan changes, there is a data point that's created, right? So hiring managers may change something with their hiring teams. They might request something different to a recruiter. They might change compensation. There is a data point hit at every part of your headcount plan. And closing out your headcount plan is the consolidation of all of those data points that are being created in this process. And so The things that we're going to be able to show you in this webinar about what you can get out of that is recruiter performance data. So there's going to be some things within your headcount plan that you can add to your recruiter scorecard, or how recruiters are doing in any given point in your performance management process. 2, you're going to have a conversation with finance about what actually happened in your business. So they said, we're going to hire one position for $120,000 a year. You're going to report back and say, yes, they started on time and we started paying them when we thought we would pay them. And yes, we hired them on band. And yes, that was the amount of people that we hired or not. And so all of that information you'll be able to give to finance to make a plan for next year. And then lastly, hiring manager accountability. So you'll be able to take the information about a hiring manager's behavior and directly point to who can do, who's doing a great job with hiring or not. And in this space of what this data provides are all these other pieces to your process that will allow you to operate more efficiently. So I'll dive into that, right? So like in this data, there's all of these different questions that you have to answer. Does recruiting have the capacity to meet the demand? Did they do what they said they would do at the beginning of the plan? And how have the changes impacted either our budget or our recruiting capacity or our hiring culture? And so I can get into all that in the next view. So recruiter performance. I don't know how many of you are responsible for putting together the recruiter scorecard for your teams, but essentially there are attached to every requisition in your hiring plan, there's information about your workload burden. So workload burden, in my opinion, it's much harder to fill a high-level role for many managers with many different pipelines that I have to source for than it is to fill a repeat role that's like an inside sales rep, which I already have a interview plan and a bunch of people that already work the job, et cetera. So you could pull information out of your headcount plan about the workload burden each of your recruiters are working. So I'll get into a little bit of that. The requisition change percentage will measure the workload difficulty of each of the actual requisitions that a recruiter will work. So a recruiter who has 10 jobs that were all the same from start to finish, and they were just able to source, do the interview process, make offers, and get them hired, that's a much easier workload than somebody who had salaries change, titles change, levels change, location change, and they have to restart their pipeline over and over again. So by tracking the amount of times a requisition changes, and if you're very detailed, the timing of those changes, you can really get into a place where you can not only, 1, paint context for your recruiter's performance, but 2, drive accountability with your hiring managers about the changes that they create. And this is a huge one when I go into any sort of QBR end of the year meeting. I'm able to drive accountability with my hiring managers about how much their changes have impacted both hires on time and hiring quality. Some other stats you could pull from other places like your ATS, or whether or not they show up to interviews or if they fill out their scorecards. But those are more experience metrics, where on the headcount plan side, that's actually going to impact your time to fill. So if I was hiring for a recruiter to work on my team and midway through the hiring manager says, nope, I need a director of recruiting, all of those recruiters are now irrelevant to that specific process, and I have to start over again as it relates to building my top of funnel. So it essentially resets my top of funnel, my top of funnel kind of start date for hires on time. And then the last thing is hires on time. So your business team is saying, so when you're at the end of the year, so you're going to take this headcount plan data and you're going to give it to your executive team like, hey, here's how we did. The executive team cares mostly about hires on time because they tie production or revenue to hires, to the hires being hired on time. So I'll give you the easiest example that I can give is a salesperson. Let's say you have a salesperson that you want to start January 1st. They make They make $120,000 a year, and they produce $240,000 of revenue. If you hire them on time, you are going to get 120K of spend and 240K of revenue on plan. Whether or not you hit that, that's for somebody else to report. But as a recruiting leader, the reason they care about hires on time is because if you hire that person February 1st, then you're going to pay 110. You're going to save OpEx, but you're going to lose revenue, 20K. So you're a net loss of 20K and so on and so forth. February, 100K, lose 40K. So all of those things about hiring on time are going to be the things that your business cares about as to like, did I meet my operating plan? Sales is the easiest because it's a dollar amount, but there's a production amount to recruiters. You could tie revenue to recruiters. You could tie revenue to customer support, to engineering. And this is how finance teams and executives make an operating plan work. They plan for hires to be hired on time. That has always been my North Star metric. The other big thing, this is the main logic that I care about when determining recruiter workload. So some of this is going to come from your hiring plan, and some of this is going to come from your ATS. The hiring plan stuff is job level. It's the number of hiring clients that individual recruiter has. So if I'm only working for one manager, I only have one manager meeting. I only have one department usually, or group of requisitions to hire. For unique titles, if I'm only hiring one title, that's one pipeline that I work out of. That's one job level. That's one top of funnel interview. That's one process, etc. And then lastly, the changes to workload, that's also out of the headcount plan. So if I know what my plan was at the beginning of the year and then I changed it at the end of the year, then all of those changes will impact the difficulty that I have in filling these roles. Candidate scarcity, that's your ATS saying how many top of funnel people do we get versus how many do I have to source. And so if I have two recruiters that both fill 10 requisitions and I'm trying to manage their performance, those two recruiters are going to say, I worked harder. No, I worked harder, especially if you have limited bonus dollars. So if you have two recruiters that both filled the same volume of roles, these workload statistics are going to help you manage whether or not you can bonus one differently than another. And so I always encourage my recruiting operations folks, those who came through Jeremy and team, to take a look at this information and supplement it with a recruiting, with the recruiter scorecard, so that you not only look at fills and experience and projects, et cetera, but you have kind of like this other algorithmic approach to how you look at the workload that your recruiters are producing. The other major thing that I look for, so backing up just one more, right? So when I make my recruiter performance scorecard, I have what I thought they would do, so their capacity, if it's 1 hire a month, 2 hires a month, 3 hires a month, what they've actually done, and then I explain my delta with some of these statistics so that we can understand whether or not there was a recruiter influence, a business influence, or a hiring manager influence to why they did or did not fill their roles on time. And so to tie it all together, on-time hiring means we're going to have revenue and OpEx start when we plan for our operating plan. And if we don't hit those numbers, so if we don't hire all the salespeople on time, during your QBR, your end of year report, you're going to be responsible for talking to people about why we didn't hit those. And so what I see happen today for a lot of different recruiting leaders is they don't use the data to answer these questions about whether or not they hit their plan. So out of your headcount plan, you're able to say it was my recruiter and my recruiter performed to the level that I expected them to versus the demand of the business. You can look at the changes and see how the hiring manager has influenced that recruiter's ability to produce hires on time. You could look at the plan from what you would initially plan for at the beginning of the quarter and the year and see how it changed from the business to see whether or not those changes impacted hiring on time. Or you could look at your hiring managers and see whether or not they're encumbering your team's ability to do this work. But at the end of every quarter or year, you should be able to distinctly say we met our headcount plan or we missed it. And if we missed it, it was the funnel, the recruiter, the hiring manager, or the business. So segueing into our hiring managers, their changes impact hires on time more than any other part of our business. A hiring manager, one, has their own spreadsheet that they maintain that can change at any time. And so we need to be able to monitor those changes so we know what they're adding or subtracting. And it's much easier to handle somebody adding something before recruiting starts than it is while recruiting is going on and you're trying to make all these fills. So if they add a role before recruiting starts, I could do my intake session, I could do my interview rubric, I could do my job description. If they change something during the recruiting period, then I am using time I should be using to recruit to intake the role and to get it produced. And the impossibility of you hiring that role on time needs to be highlighted during your executive meeting. So what I do in my headcount plan is I flag every role that had a change during the recruiting time. I do this because it will allow me to look at the percentage of roles that went on plan. So like if I'm given a plan to do 100 recs in a year and 50 of them had a change while I was working on them, that is a percentage that's going to be significant when I talk about hires on time. So I'll bow that up and kind of put that over here. So that's the hiring manager will impact your ability to do your work as a recruiting leader. During the offer is the whole other section of what to do. And you're going to hear me get kind of passionate about this because at Uber, we had an issue with pay discrepancy. And the root cause, in my opinion, of this pay discrepancy was that when it came time to offer somebody a role at the end of the process, we said, if we don't hire this person, we're going to miss. It's going to be the worst. We're not going to meet our goals. You're blocking me recruiting. And they would just, we have to hire this person. It's only 10 grand more. It's only 20 grand more. Just make this exception just once. And all of you are probably going through this at most of your offers, especially the earlier stage company that you are. And what happens when that happens is in that moment, everyone forgets about the broader perspective, about what the company actually is, about what your leveling framework actually is. And they say, okay, yes, we need it. And we're going to get our profits now. So let's do it right now. But if you zoom out at this end of year review or this QBR review, and you say, okay, how do I look at the forest through the trees, right? How do I say, like, yes, we made 10 exceptions, but 10 exceptions created what? And who's the main person creating these exceptions? And what you'll find is some common situations. Empire builders, for you, those of you who are in early startups, you might have a recruiting leader a hiring manager who's like, I need all directors. I want to hire the best people, but they only get individual contributors on their hiring plan. So they leverage the offer process to get that person, they're going to get that person in for a different title or dollar amount when they have the chance. And you need to drive accountability to those folks. You need to show the impact of what deltas in your leveling framework or your comp framework look like. And so by marking all of the roles in your headcount plan that have had a change during the offer period, you're going to note, how do we stop the cultural impact that is from hiring? Or how do we at least get in front of it so we're not looking up after a few years saying like, ooh, how are we have such pay discrepancy between these different groups of people? So I always have a standout slide on it. Hiring manager accountability. If you're a recruiting leader and you don't fill a role, you're usually the person holding the bag, right? It's very rare that in the executive meeting, if you're talking about missing goals, that someone is self-aware to the change that they've created, blocking the goal, and then they're going to be like, oh yeah, you know what? Sorry for making all those changes. That's my fault. They're going to be like, nope, I missed my goals. We didn't recruit in time. And they may even deep down know that they contributed to it, but at the time when it's like, performance end of the year process, they're not as willing to admit that their changes are there, or they might not even be aware, or they might not be tracking it. So having clear data about the number of recs that change allow you to have air cover for your team and drive accountability with your hiring managers who are making these changes. changes. And I promise you that is going to be the culture saver for most young organizations, is driving that hiring manager accountability and doing so in a way that it's not like blaming. You're doing it in a way that is it's about the data, right? It's not about, oh, they did this, they did that. It's, oh, there were 50 out of 100 things changed. What would you like to do about it? These changes happened before, during, or at the offer process. How should we be responding to that? And you can take a partner with HR because they're not going to want the comp variance from offer. You could take a partner with finance because they don't want the issue with the financial variance. And you could start to develop air cover that gives you some executive clout when it comes to managing this process. So what are all the changes that you can get or create? One, requests and approvals. I see so many different request and approval processes in all of the different environments that I've created. Part of the reason why I started Headcount 365 was to take the headcount request and approval process and put some control around it. Get out of email, get out of Jira, get out of one-on-one meetings, trying to wrangle all the change, like have one single source of truth for where all the changes come from. So one, is it, who needs to approve it? Who's accountable for the main changes? So if it's a finance change, make sure finance signs off on it and you have a record of it, so that at the end of the year, when you're explaining a salary variance, then you have a way to determine, like, oh, the finance team has signed off on all these variances. But that's the number one creator of change, is the request and approval process. The next, for those of you who are unlucky enough, unfortunately, this time around, to go through a RIF or have your company go through a RIF, finance will drive changes that just the rest of the business has to eat. And sometimes they're transparent about it and sometimes they're not. But it's important as a talent leader that you manage this this finance-driven change as a snapshot. So if you're in spreadsheets, you could take a workbook and you snapshot the workbook, and you say, at this time we had X amount of requisitions for X amount of salaries, and this is where we were. And then you create a new workbook and you could do some comparative analysis between those two workbooks, so that on a quarterly reforecast, during a RIF, half-year reforecast, you have, what was it before and what did you ask me to do when we first started versus what is being asked of me today. And that is what happens in an end of year meeting, is everyone forgets the first plan. That's just part of, it's like human nature. Everyone forgets, oh, I asked you to do 100 roles at the beginning of the year and it's 200 now. Well, I only staffed you at the very beginning of the year. You got your headcount, you got your recruiters, you got your coordinators, you got your RecOps team at the beginning of the year, and we changed, and you should just be able to go for that change. Well, now is your time to talk about how those changes have impacted your recruiting capacity or your demand. The last thing is ATS and comp. So this is the offer approval piece. So if you have 100 people who work at your company and 100 people who will work at your company, the main financial variance comes from the people who are future employees who will work at your company. You only do promotions once, you only do salary adjustments once, you only do annual reviews once. And so it's relatively predictable on the who works here, what's going to happen to your financials. But when you're in the heat of the offer and someone's pushing for that extra 20K to go over band, it's going to be a difficult walk back for you to get the information from finance and say, hey, this cultural impact is now fixable. So you got to be ahead of all of those comp level changes from your ATS. And so for those of you unfamiliar with the Talent Collective, they have a number of different courses or meetups or roundtables that they do around managing change, whether it's from the recruiting process or the recruiting operations process or from the HR side. Take a look at their content calendar and see what works for them, but there'll be some interesting content coming out as it relates to managing the financials, managing the changes from your organization in the future. And so, yes, you need to report on change. So we're going to get into that next. The change creates, the biggest part of change is the financial impact. So for those of you who want to advance your recruiting leader career, the number one way I see that is by getting fluent with finance. So understanding how finance works is going to significantly impact your ability to advance in the organization, because you're able to speak in the language of the business. So controversial or not, recruiting is a service provider to the business. The business pays the service of recruiting salaries and resources to produce hires, and that's the way finance will think about that organization. So you're creating value for the organization. They pay you for that value, and there's a delta between the value you create as an in-house team versus what you can get externally versus what they could do if they made their hiring managers do it. And then there is a return on that investment by way of we've hired people on time and revenue is starting to come in the building. When you reframe the context of how you talk to a finance person with that in mind, you're then able to unlock things for yourself. So one, OpEx. OpEx is what the company is going to spend, operating expenditures on headcount predominantly. And so when you miss a start date, when you add a requisition, when there's a backfills create savings for a few months, then they restart the count on salary. Net new people add OpEx to the plan, and changes, whether it's start date or salary, will impact the OpEx plan overall. And so as a finance leader, when, I think in the recruiting space on the service side, we're, I won't say anti-button seat thought process, but because there's so much more to what we do about experience and the process and the evaluation and that transition from being a candidate to an employee. But as a finance person, they look at OpEx is starting, revenue is starting, OpEx is finished, revenue is finished. So you can have both mindsets, but when you're in the executive room trying to talk to folks about what OpEx is, you need to be prepared to talk about what did we think we were going to spend? How is that? What was the last thing you approved, and what is our variance from those numbers? So if we wanted a salesperson at 120 at the beginning of the year and we didn't hire him until July, how much money did we give up? And how do we plan to rectify that in the future, especially as it starts to build up? If you keep missing targets or there's this cascading miss of hiring effort. So speaking in terms of OpEx is going to be the biggest thing that you can do as it relates to like getting yourself more executive headroom when you're in that strategy meeting. In doing so, the revenue variance is the next most critical piece. So every business plan is built off of some level of production, right? At Uber, it was we launch a city creates rides. So we would launch cities would create rides would create revenue that would fuel our hiring plan. And every company has something that they produce that generates money. And so to the extent that a hire is impacting that revenue, you should be able to articulate revenue and hiring time. And that is how you speak to the finance team, particularly about agency use, which I'm going to go off on a little side tangent here because it's always a popular question, but recruiting agencies cost a lot of money to get supplemental capacity. So if you are in a place where you're late on a hire or you're late on many hires and you're trying to justify whether or not you should spend money to get those hires, being behind on plan isn't enough. Because the hiring manager wants it isn't enough. You have to be able to say, because we haven't hired this salesperson, we're down 100K in revenue this year alone. I'd like to use the OpEx savings from being late to spend it on an agency so that we can go capture that revenue, since we have a lot of demand on the recruiting plate. And so that logic, right? Speaking to finance in that way, if you take one thing away from this session about agencies, particularly, that's how finance thinks about them. I've never seen them approve it in any other way other than OpEx and revenue. So know your numbers. And then lastly, total plan variance is a way that, especially in your end of year reforecast for 2024, is an idea of what is possible. So at the end of 2023, you look at your plan, you say, here's what I spent. And this is what I thought I was going to spend, and here's the delta. And if you can explain why, that will allow you to get more resources for 2023. It will unlock agency use. It will drive air cover to hiring manager issues But if you can quantify it, you get one time a year to say, because this is the biggest number, you're going to combine all 4 quarters of variance. You're going to say, this was the issue. And you're going to get one time to tell executives, hey, here's the global impact from recruiting. Do you want that to happen next year? No, here's what I need on my team. And this idea that you're speaking in the financial terms, it makes it hard to refute because there's a direct line to revenue and OpEx. So all the things that I talked about as it relates to 2023 are all the data that you need to do 2 things. One, report on what happened and drive air cover and drive accountability for your recruiting team, your hiring managers. And so hopefully you've taken away how monitoring change, monitoring OpEx and revenue, and monitoring the timing of those changes will help you manage your hiring managers, your finance team, your recruiters, right? So when you're doing your performance management, you can supplement your scorecards, you can get your air cover, you can kind of protect your team if there's business-driven change. And that's what you're going to do out of the 2023 headcount plan. However, at the exact same time, all of us are probably going through it as we speak now, you're figuring out what's going to go on for 2024, which means we're going to give you another 100 requisitions and you need to fill them next year too. So you need to take and apply this information to that plan. And now's your time to go to bat for everything that you want on your team. So there's 3 scenarios that I typically cover, and we're going to go into more depth in a future webinar, probably at the beginning of the year in 2024 for those who are interested. So stay tuned from this group about another session in this area. But the 3 most common situations I have is front-loaded hiring, plan anchoring, and cost categorization for recruiting. So front-loaded hiring means if you were asked to do 100, if you have the capacity to hire 100 people and you're asked to do 100 people of hiring, but they asked you to do it in the first 6 months, you don't have the capacity for 100 people. You have the capacity for 50 out of 100, right? Because it's a linear capacity. You can't move your capacity forward magically. Your recruiters have some level of linear workload that they need to do. And so what I often see is companies will make their 2024 plan. They will say, all right, it's set in stone. How much capacity do we have? We're good to go. And there's 0 context put into that planning. And so with 2023 data, you can say, here's the amount of requisitions that we had. Here's how many we had to carry forward because we missed hiring them. Here's the total rate change, right? So people will also omit backfills and other changes to the plan. So you can say, yes, last year you gave us 100 also, but we actually need to be staffed for 150, or we would need to use supplemental resources going forward. And so taking this data and applying it to 2024 means knowing your change rate, knowing your financial variance, knowing your revenue impact, knowing your capacity versus demand, and being able to apply it to 2024 so that when you go to get that same, the business is putting in an order with the talent service for 100 roles next year, you know whether or not you're going to be able to fulfill that order, and you can get in front of what you're going to need to meet that demand. Plan anchoring, that's similar to what we were talking about with changes. Is at the beginning, you could be at the end of 2023, you can show a 50% change rate for all roles, and you could show that change rate at varying stages of the process. You could show that to an executive, be like, oh, this year we had 50% of our roles had some sort of change while we were working on them. I will bet almost everything I'm worth that executive will be like, well, we won't do that next year. And then they won't factor any of it in to what 2024 looks like at all. And so you need to be that change rate of what happens to the plan when we set it needs to be your anchoring tool for driving executive accountability. And so you should partner with your head of HR, your head of finance, to just say, this is the facts of the case from last year. They can sell you on whether or not they want to apply it to this year. And then they are essentially your executive sponsor for whether or not changes start to impact your hiring plan next year. And I always make sure I get a finance person in my pocket to say, okay, my change rate was 50% last year. That means we added X amount of backfills, X amount of net new hires, and we've changed things this many times while we were working on it. all of those changes, I'm going to apply in a percentage basis to next year. Tell me why I shouldn't do that, or give me the resources so that I can solve it. And if they don't do it, then they're my sponsor after the Q1 reforecast, after the Q2 reforecast, if we start to fall victim to the same stuff. And so now I have shared accountability with that finance person, so I can unlock the recs that I have. So it's not just recruiter underperformance or bad planning, et cetera, right? So it's really taking this data that you mine out of your 2023 headcount plan and you apply it for reporting, yes, but it's also an application for 2024. And then the last piece, this recruiting spend is blocked by cost categorization. Recruiting leader to recruiting leaders, right? Like, I am telling you from experience, I've been in the boardroom at investment banks. I've been at the executive table for these tech companies. Recruiting is viewed as a cost center in the same way that finance or HR or any other support item to revenue and production is, meaning you don't directly generate revenue. And what you'll find is people just expect you to do more with less without processing it in the same way that they would a sales team. So for example, if I had a sales team that needed to close 10 accounts per month and per seller, and I had 100 accounts, I need 10 sellers. If I have one recruiter who could do 10 requisitions a month and they need 100 requisitions a month, I need 10 recruiters. But so many times I see this just not considered, because it's like, oh, just do more with less, do more with less. And so this data not only helps you quantify what the impact is of them putting that pressure, it gives you the forum to talk about how other things might be impacted should you focus solely on production. So I have another webinar that I've done where it's like, what can a recruiter actually do? And there's production tasks, and there's administrative tasks, and there's project tasks. So you can create a great experience and decline everybody with great feedback and run a great interview loop and walk in every candidate and give them that all-star experience, but you're going to hire less people per month. Or you can get rid of all that and you can hire more people per month, but you're going to have worse Glassdoor reviews or worse experience pieces, right? So yes, you're a cost center in their mind. I don't believe it, but in their mind, you're a cost center. So how do you get around that? You explain OpEx and revenue, you ask for your supplements where needed, and you are transparent about where the sacrifice will come from should you not get all this information. And so that is our webinar. I know we have 15 minutes or so left. I always open it up for interactive Q&A on any of this type of stuff. If you are interested in getting something answered specifically for you, or just want to bring something to the group, feel free to pop it in chat, raise your hand, unmute, ask me direct, follow up with me afterwards, however you'd like to do it. But the floor is yours. I see a chat. Thank you. Well, my plug here is, as you guys are figuring out what your 2023 plan will look like, stay tuned. So I'm going to release next month a QBR download, so you can get exactly how I would calculate all this information in spreadsheets, as well as like an overarching how-to. I will summarize up this webinar in an article and maybe make it available for download. And if at any point any of you need any help with anything in the headcount space, all of us who have put on this webinar are more than capable of answering questions. And as a quick reminder, PURPL does peer-to-peer learning sessions, and head over to PURPL.io for any of the sessions that might be relevant for your particular area. The Talent Collective is for empowering and advancing women in the space, and a lot of these topics will be covered not only in this webinar, but in future webinars that they'll put on with or without me. The People group is for jamming in Slack across any across any discipline, across any position in HR. Unicorn Talent, obviously download the headcount plan that we have there. It'll give you some guidance on how to calculate all this information. And the RecOps Collective, or the Recruiting Operations Collective, always has a great newsletter and community aspect to it about what's going on in the recruiting operations space, which is predominantly where we are here. So Thank you for joining. I appreciate all of you for being a part of this session. We'll release more. And if you found it helpful, please let the hosts put them on. And if you have any feedback, you have my email here. It's shared on the screen. If you want to see something more, if you want to see something specific, let me know and I'm happy to answer your questions. Have a good rest of the day, everybody.
Thank you, Eric.